Folks, we've got less than a month before Amazon resumes their destruction of Lord of the Rings, and while the first episode of Season 2 is still weeks away, we've already got cast members for Rings of Power attacking Lord of the Rings fans. This here is from Entertainment Weekly. Rings of Power star Ismael Cruz Cordova is proud to be the series' first non-white elf. I love the nerve that I pinched. And Cruz Cordova, he played an elf named Arendir, a character that Amazon completely made up. He's not a character from Lord of the Rings, he's not a character from the Silmarillion, or any other works of Tolkien. He's a character that Amazon completely made up for no other reason than to check off diversity boxes. You also have the dwarf Disa, who also checks some boxes off. You had the character Bronwyn, also put in there to check boxes off. Amazon also made up a character called Adar, some elf that was put in there for no other reason than to humanize evil, to make things more morally gray, because that's a trend we commonly see in current day Hollywood, current day entertainment. Never mind that Lord of the Rings is very much a good and evil story. Never mind that Lord of the Rings gained millions and millions of fans as a good and evil story. Amazon, in all their arrogance and all their perceived sophistication, they thought that they could take a literary masterpiece and they could improve upon it. They thought that they were better than Tolkien, who is maybe the greatest author to ever live. So Cruz Cordova, he gave a recent interview during Entertainment Weekly's Brave Warriors panel at Comic-Con 2024. Lord of the Rings Rings of Power star Ismael Cruz Cordova spoke frankly about the racism and ignorance he faced after being cast as the elven everyman Arendir in the Prime Video series based on J.R.R. Tolkien's fiction. Yeah, you see how they word this, you see how this will be going. My character is not in the lore of Lord of the Rings, and that was an issue for some people, Cordova said. Which, if he's not a real character in the world of Lord of the Rings, yeah, people are going to have issues with it. Call me crazy here, but if you're going to make an adaptation for Lord of the Rings, the fans are going to expect to see Lord of the Rings, as it was originally written. If they're going to make an adaptation of Tolkien's world, the fans are going to want an adaptation that is accurate to that world. In other words, the fans don't want to see made-up characters, they don't want to see outside agendas being pushed into the story, and those are completely reasonable things for fans to want. So he continues, noting that it was a big controversy of me being the first elf that wasn't white. He added, I love the nerve that I pinched, I really do. I was so excited to create something new. A lot of people speaking on behalf of Tolkien, I don't know if they understand the spirit of Tolkien. His work speaks of the times. Alright, the first part of this comment, the first elf that wasn't white. I've said this before and I'll say this again. Lord of the Rings, it is based on European mythology, it is based on European folklore. If you're telling a story based on Japanese folklore or Japanese history, logically the people in that story would be Japanese. Or if you told a story based on Chinese folklore, logically the people in that story would be Chinese. If you told a story based on Middle Eastern folklore, logically the people in that story would be Middle Eastern. If you told a story based on Indian folklore, logically the people in there would be Indian. If you told a story based on African mythology and folklore, or African customs or traditions, then logically the people in that story would be African, and so on and so forth. But by that very same logic, if they made a story based on European mythology or European folklore, then logically the people in that story, they're going to be European in appearance. Which means, yeah, it's going to be a bunch of white people in there. Does that mean that the story is racist because it has a bunch of white people in it? No. It's just that it's based on that mythology, that folklore, that area of the world. So they follow the context and they cast accordingly. And the controversy around the casting for the Rings of Power is that they're casting based on their diversity quotas, not based on the lore of Lord of the Rings. They're casting to check boxes off. And that is the sole reason why it's being done. Back before Season 1 of the Rings of Power came out, when talking about how diverse the cast was, how historic it was, things like that, the executive producer of the series, Lindsay Weber, she said, it felt only natural to us that an adaptation of Tolkien's work would reflect what the world actually looks like. And I've said this before and I'll say this as many times as I need to. Fantasy, by its very definition, does not reflect the real world. It's called fantasy because it's not real. Cordova then says, I love the nerve that I pinched, I really do. So in other words, the goal is not to tell a faithful adaptation of Tolkien's work, it's to spite the fans, it's to piss off the fans, it's to piss off all the right people, quote unquote. I was so excited to create something new. Now this quote right here, Lord of the Rings is not a new story, it's been around for decades. The Silmarillion has been around for decades. Tolkien's work has been around for a while, he's been dead for 50 years. Now if you want to create a new fantasy story, absolutely, go right ahead. And since it's a new story, since it's your story, you can do whatever you want with it. If you want to make it as similar to the real world as possible, you're free to do so. If you're the one writing the story, if it's your story, you can do whatever you want with it. And that's the fun part about creating a story. You've got the freedom to do whatever you want in it. You can put anything in there that you want, you can have anything happen in there that you want. But these people at Amazon, they did not write Lord of the Rings. Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings. It is Tolkien's story, not Amazon's. And because Amazon did not write Lord of the Rings, they do not have the right to fundamentally change it. Yes, Lord of the Rings is not diverse by today's standards. It's based on European mythology and folklore. But you know what? If you don't like that, write your own story. If Amazon were to write their own story rather than take somebody else's story and change it, then there would be no issue with this sort of thing. So then he says, a lot of people speaking on behalf of Tolkien, I don't know if they understand the spirit of Tolkien. His work speaks of the times. So the people attacking Lord of the Rings fans, the people defending Rings of Power. And look, there's all kinds of problems with that show. You can talk about how bad the writing is. You can talk about how far it strayed from Tolkien's lore. You could talk about plenty of other problems. How bad the fight scenes were, things like that. But this video and this article here that I'm reading, it talks more about the diversity of the cast. So that's the aspect of the show that I'm talking about and why it doesn't quite make sense. But the people that defend Rings of Power, generally you see two different arguments. And Cordova saying, a lot of people speaking on behalf of Tolkien, I don't know if they understand the spirit of Tolkien, his work speaks of the times. He's making one of those arguments right here. So the first argument is basically Tolkien was woke. And they'll often say something like Lord of the Rings is about different races coming together to solve a problem or to defeat evil. Or something like that. It's about people recognizing their diversity. But what they'll basically say is that Tolkien was woke, he was always woke, and therefore you Lord of the Rings fans, you have no understanding of the author. And then the other argument that people make, the people who defend Rings of Power, basically they say, yeah, Tolkien's work is outdated, it's not diverse by today's standards, it shows men and women in traditional gender roles and therefore it's sexist, the story doesn't have any LGBTQ+ characters in it, therefore Tolkien's work is toxic, it's problematic, and we need to change it, we need to update it for modern audiences. The people who defend Rings of Power, they generally make one of those two arguments. Now, both of those arguments contradict each other, you can't have it both ways, but those are the two arguments that they make. One, Tolkien was always woke, and two, Tolkien's work is toxic and problematic and outdated, and we need to fix that. And in this interview for Entertainment Weekly, Cordova makes both of these arguments in the same interview. Right here, he makes the first argument that Tolkien was always woke. So the interview continues, reflecting on the nature of fantasy storytelling and what it can reveal. Cordova said, "We work with these deep existential questions, and those questions change with the times." Just before this, he was making the first argument, that Tolkien basically was always woke. And now he's pivoting to the second argument that Lord of the Rings needs to be updated for modern audiences. We can't retell something like Lord of the Rings today, 2024, without introducing different existential questions, and that comes in the form of character. We can't retell Lord of the Rings today in the current year without introducing different questions. Yes you can. You can retell Lord of the Rings today without introducing these whatever existential questions you're talking about. All you have to do is stick to the original writings of Tolkien. Lord of the Rings is a timeless masterpiece, with timeless themes of good versus evil, courage, friendship, loyalty, selflessness. Those types of themes are strong, and if you ask me, those types of themes are ultimately what resonate with an audience. And they resonate with audiences of all different races, creeds, religions, languages. Those themes are timeless, which means that they resonate with people no matter what time period it is. And because they're timeless, that means that they do not need to be quote-unquote updated for modern audiences. Alright, and then the next two paragraphs, he just talks about his character. I really don't care about that stuff. But we'll continue here. Part of why Cordova is happy to have touched a nerve is because he sees his presence and character as part of a natural evolution of how the fantasy genre should operate. It is necessary to revise things and represent and exist, he said. Again, just earlier he said, a lot of people speaking on behalf of Tolkien, I don't know if they understand the spirit of Tolkien, his work speaks of the times. And then later on in the interview he says it is necessary to revise things. So he's contradicting himself. Again, the two arguments that the woke crowd makes, the people that defend Rings of Power make. Number one, Tolkien was always woke. He basically made that argument here, and then later in the interview he says we can't retell something like Lord of the Rings today, 2024, the current year, without introducing different existential questions. And then he says it is necessary to revise things and represent and exist. Particularly, it is necessary to revise things. I thought you said earlier that Tolkien's work speaks of the times. Again, the two arguments from the woke crowd, the people who defend Rings of Power. Number one, Tolkien was always woke, and number two, Lord of the Rings needs to be updated. Those two arguments, they contradict each other. You cannot have it both ways. And Cordova here, he makes both arguments in the same interview. He is contradicting himself. And then he says, I think a lot of people look at us to affirm their own existence. So I'm happy people can look at that and look at any of us and see themselves in this beautiful world. We should all belong in fantasy. And then this quote right here, he's making a broader statement, fantasy, the genre of fantasy as a whole. But we're not talking about fantasy as a whole here. We're talking specifically about Lord of the Rings. If you want to write your own story, again, go right ahead and do that. You're free to write your own story, and you're free to make it reflect the real world as much as you want. But Lord of the Rings, that's not your story, that's Tolkien's story. So when you adapt Tolkien's story, you stick to Tolkien's work. You stick to Tolkien's lore, you stick to Tolkien's vision. I've said this before and I'll say it again. Nobody, and I repeat nobody, has a problem with diversity by itself. But there are some instances where it does not make sense. It would not make sense to cast a white guy as Aladdin. It would not make sense to put a white guy in Ghost of Tsushima. It does not make sense to have a white guy as Black Panther. And the reason why it would make sense is because those stories, they were made to reflect those regions of the world. And on the exact same note, by the exact same logic, Lord of the Rings was meant as a mythology for England. It was based on European mythology and folklore. And that region of the world, yeah, it's a bunch of white people. So in context and adaptation for Lord of the Rings, it's not quite going to be diverse by today's standards. And that's why Lord of the Rings fans looked at the casting for Rings of Power and said, this does not make sense. If this was not Lord of the Rings, if this was just some generic fantasy that Amazon made up on their own, there wouldn't be any issue with it. But it's Lord of the Rings. Amazon did not write Lord of the Rings, but they sure are changing it. And they're changing it for no other reason than to quote-unquote update it for modern audiences, to inject their own agendas into it, and to turn Lord of the Rings into a platform. And that is why Lord of the Rings fans are criticizing Rings of Power. But instead of listening to the fans, the people at Amazon decided to call the fans names, call them bigots. They decided to gaslight Lord of the Rings fans, and they decided to fight with the fans. And because of that, this show will continue to fail. Everyone, I hope you enjoy this video, and I'll see you next time. Take care until then.